In this episode, we start by turning privacy risk management into something you can picture as a routine, because beginners often hear the word risk and imagine either scary worst-case stories or complicated math that only experts use. In privacy engineering, risk management is a repeatable way of deciding what matters most, what could go wrong for individuals and the organization, and what controls should be used to reduce harm to an acceptable level. The CDPSE exam expects you to understand risk management as a living process supported by policies, roles, and evidence, not as a one-time assessment that sits in a folder. Consistency is critical because privacy decisions are made across many teams and many projects. And without a consistent process, similar situations get different answers, which creates fairness problems and compliance problems. Repeatability is critical because privacy risks change as systems change, vendors change, and purposes evolve, and the organization must be able to revisit decisions without starting from zero each time. You will learn how a privacy risk management process is structured, why policies are the glue that keeps it stable, and how to avoid common beginner mistakes like treating risk as purely technical or purely legal. By the end, you should be able to describe a privacy risk process as a set of steps with clear inputs, outputs, and decision points that can be applied in any scenario. A helpful way to begin is to define privacy risk in plain language, because many new learners confuse risk to the organization with risk to the individual, and a mature program considers both. Privacy risk is the chance that personal information handling will lead to harm, which can include harm to individuals such as loss of confidentiality, unfair treatment, discrimination, identity theft, loss of control over personal choices, or loss of trust. It can also include harm to the organization such as regulatory penalties, reputational damage, operational disruption, contract breaches, or loss of customer confidence. The exam often tests whether you recognize that privacy risk includes more than just unauthorized access, because misuse, inappropriate sharing, excessive retention, and opaque processing can also create harm even if systems are secure. Another important idea is that privacy risk depends on context, because the same data element can be low risk in one setting and high risk in another depending on sensitivity, scale, and how the data is used. For example, a location signal used to show a weather forecast might be low risk if it is coarse and temporary, while the same signal used to infer patterns of life over time can be high risk. When you can explain privacy risk as harm in context, you are ready to build a process that consistently evaluates it rather than relying on instincts. A consistent risk management process begins with policy, because policy establishes the organization's definitions, expectations, and decision rules so teams do not invent their own risk logic. A risk management policy usually defines what the organization considers a privacy risk, what categories of processing require evaluation, how risk is assessed, who approves decisions, and what documentation must be produced. It also defines how often assessments must be revisited, what triggers reevaluation, and how exceptions are handled. The exam treats policy as an accountability mechanism because policy is how leadership expresses what standards must be followed and how compliance is measured. Beginners sometimes think policy is a static document, but a good policy is a tool that creates consistency across projects, vendors, and system changes. Policy also supports fairness because it reduces the chance that one team receives strict requirements while another team gets a pass for a similar activity. Another important point is that policy should be realistic because policies that are too vague cannot be enforced, and policies that are too strict will be ignored. A mature program writes policies that teams can actually follow and then backs them with procedures and training. When policy is clear, the risk process becomes repeatable because everyone understands the steps and expectations. Once policy sets the rules, the risk management process can be thought of as a cycle that repeats: identify, assess, respond, document, and monitor. Identification means recognizing when a new activity, system, or change introduces privacy risk, such as a new data collection, a new use of existing data, a new vendor relationship, or a change in sharing or retention. Assessment means analyzing the risk in a structured way, including what data is involved, what processing occurs, what harms are plausible, and what existing controls are in place. Response means choosing what to do about the risk, which could include mitigation, transfer through contracts or insurance, avoidance by not doing the activity, or acceptance with documented rationale. Documentation means recording the decision logic, approvals, and planned controls so the organization can prove it acted responsibly. Monitoring means checking whether controls are implemented and operating and whether risk changes over time, which keeps the process from becoming stale. The exam expects you to understand this cycle because scenario questions often ask what the next step should be after a new risk is discovered or after a change occurs. Beginners sometimes jump straight to mitigation without assessing scope, while others write an assessment but never ensure controls are implemented. A repeatable process keeps those steps connected so nothing falls through the cracks. Identification is where consistency often breaks down because risks are missed when there is no clear trigger or when teams do not recognize that privacy risk exists. A mature program defines triggers that require risk evaluation, such as collecting new categories of personal information, processing sensitive categories, using data for new purposes, increasing scale, introducing profiling or automated decisions, sharing data with new vendors, or transferring data across borders. Identification also includes recognizing risks that emerge from operational events, such as incidents, audit findings, or repeated request handling failures. The exam may test identification by describing a feature change that seems small, but introduces a new use of data, and the correct answer often involves triggering a privacy risk review before proceeding. Another important identification habit is thinking about data flow, because privacy risk often appears at boundaries, such as when data moves to analytics platforms or when support teams access data from different regions. Beginners sometimes assume privacy risk is only in the main production database, yet risk can also appear in logs, backups, test environments, and vendor systems. Identification becomes consistent when it is embedded into normal workflows like product development, procurement, change management, and incident response. When identification is reliable, the organization stops being surprised by privacy risk and starts managing it proactively. Assessment is the step where you turn a vague concern into a structured understanding that can support a decision, and the exam expects you to be comfortable with assessment logic even if you are new. A privacy risk assessment usually examines what personal information is involved, who the individuals are, what purposes exist, what processing steps occur, where data flows, what controls exist, and what threats and failure modes could cause harm. It also considers likelihood and impact in a practical sense, recognizing that likelihood is influenced by exposure pathways and control strength, while impact is influenced by sensitivity, scale, and the nature of harm. A beginner misunderstanding is treating likelihood as a guess, but likelihood can be reasoned about by considering factors like the number of people who have access, the presence of monitoring, the stability of vendor controls, and the history of similar incidents. Another misunderstanding is treating impact as only financial impact to the organization, but privacy impact includes harm to individuals and to trust, which may not be easily reduced to dollars. The exam may test whether you can recognize that a high-impact risk can exist even when likelihood is low, such as exposure of highly sensitive data, and that the response must consider that reality. Assessment should result in clear statements of risk and clear recommendations or decisions about controls. When assessment is consistent, different teams can compare risks across projects using the same logic. A repeatable process also requires a standardized way to describe risk, because inconsistent language leads to inconsistent decisions. Many programs use risk categories or scales, but the exam is less interested in the exact scale and more interested in the discipline of using a consistent method. This includes defining what constitutes low, medium, and high risk in privacy terms, such as how sensitivity, scale, and purpose influence impact. It also includes defining what controls are expected at different levels, such as when an assessment is required, when leadership approval is required, or when additional safeguards must be implemented before launch. Standardization helps teams communicate and reduces arguments, because decisions rely on defined criteria rather than personalities. It also supports monitoring and reporting, because leadership can see where risk is concentrated across the organization. Beginners sometimes worry that standardization makes the process rigid, but a good standard includes flexibility through documented exceptions and risk acceptance mechanisms. The exam may test whether you can keep the process consistent while still allowing practical decisions, which means you document trade-offs rather than pretending they do not exist. When risk language is standardized, the process becomes repeatable because the same activity is evaluated in the same way over time. Risk response is where privacy risk management becomes action, and the exam expects you to understand response options as choices with accountability, not as automatic steps. Mitigation means implementing controls that reduce likelihood or impact, such as limiting data collection, restricting access, improving transparency, or tightening retention. Avoidance means choosing not to pursue a processing activity because the privacy risk is too high or cannot be reduced to an acceptable level. Transfer can include shifting certain responsibilities through contracts, such as vendor obligations, but transfer does not remove accountability, so oversight and evidence still matter. Acceptance means acknowledging residual risk and documenting why it is acceptable, who approved it, and what conditions apply, such as monitoring or periodic review. A common beginner misunderstanding is thinking acceptance is irresponsible, but in real governance it can be appropriate when risk is understood, mitigations are in place, and leadership makes a documented decision. Another misunderstanding is thinking mitigation must always be technical, when many privacy mitigations are process controls like review gates, training, or documentation improvements. The exam often tests whether you choose responses that match the situation, such as requiring minimization and transparency changes for a new data use, or requiring vendor oversight enhancements for outsourced processing. Risk response is also where you connect back to policy, because policy defines who can approve what and what evidence must be produced. When responses are consistent, similar risks produce similar control expectations, which supports fairness and defensibility. Documentation is what makes risk management defensible and repeatable, because without a written record, the organization cannot prove it assessed risk or followed its own policy. Risk documentation should capture scope, data categories, purposes, data flows, identified risks, chosen responses, implemented controls, residual risk, and approvals. It should also capture assumptions and constraints, because many risk decisions depend on conditions like expected volumes, intended uses, or vendor locations. And if those conditions change, the decision must be revisited. The exam often tests whether you understand that documentation should be maintained and updated, not just created once, because systems evolve and the risk profile changes over time. Documentation also supports incident response, because assessment records help responders understand what data and risks were anticipated and what controls were supposed to be in place. Another important point is that documentation should be usable by people who were not involved in the original decision, which matters during audits and staff turnover. Beginners sometimes produce documentation that is too vague, like saying risk is managed, but a mature record includes specific controls and evidence expectations. When documentation is strong, the organization can show consistency across projects and can explain why certain decisions were made. That is exactly the type of accountability the exam is designed to measure. Monitoring and review keep risk management alive, because privacy risk is not static, and the exam expects you to understand that a process that never revisits decisions will drift into failure. Monitoring includes checking whether required controls were implemented, whether they operate as intended, and whether metrics indicate emerging problems, such as repeated incidents or delayed rights fulfillment. Review includes periodic reassessment of high-risk processing, reassessment when significant changes occur, and reassessment when regulations or business purposes change. A mature program defines triggers for review, such as adding new data categories, expanding to new regions, introducing new vendors, or changing retention. It also defines responsibilities for monitoring, because someone must own follow-through, not just initial assessments. The exam may test this by describing a program that performs assessments but does not track implementation, and the correct answer often involves establishing monitoring and accountability. Another important point is that monitoring supports continuous improvement, because patterns in incidents, complaints, or audit findings feed back into policy updates and training. Beginners sometimes treat monitoring as surveillance, but in governance terms it is quality control for privacy outcomes. When monitoring is built into the process, risk management stays consistent and repeatable because it can adapt without losing structure. A consistent privacy risk management process also needs to scale because organizations vary from small teams to complex enterprises with many products and vendors. Scaling does not mean making everything heavy. It means applying depth where risk is high and keeping lighter processes where risk is lower. Risk-based scaling is itself an exam concept because it reflects proportionality and practicality. For low-risk processing, the organization might use standardized checklists and lighter documentation, while for high-risk processing it might require formal assessments, leadership approvals, and more rigorous monitoring. The key is that scaling still follows the same underlying process steps and policy definitions, so consistency is preserved even when effort varies. Another scaling factor is embedding risk management into workflows, so teams do not have to remember to do it. It happens as part of product development, procurement, and change management. The exam may reward answers that integrate risk review into normal processes because integration is how repeatability is achieved in real life. Scaling also includes training, because people across the organization must recognize when to trigger risk review and how to contribute to assessments. When a process scales, it becomes resilient to growth and change, which is one of the most important goals of privacy governance. As we close, building a privacy risk management process that stays consistent and repeatable means creating a policy-backed cycle that identifies risk, assesses it with structured logic, chooses responses with accountable decision-making, documents those decisions as usable evidence, and monitors outcomes so the process stays alive. Privacy risk is best understood as the chance of harm to individuals and the organization based on context, sensitivity, scale, and processing behavior, not only as a technical vulnerability. Policies create consistency by defining triggers, methods, ownership, approvals, and documentation expectations, while embedding risk management into workflows ensures risks are identified before harm occurs. Assessment turns uncertainty into clear risk statements. Response turns risk into action through mitigation, avoidance, transfer, or acceptance, and documentation makes the program defensible and durable through change. Monitoring and review prevent drift by ensuring controls are implemented and reevaluations occur when systems, vendors, or purposes change. The CDPSE exam rewards this capability because privacy engineering depends on reliable, repeatable decision processes that keep obligations and controls aligned across an organization. When you can explain this process clearly and apply it to scenarios, you demonstrate the kind of governance maturity that makes privacy outcomes stable over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.